The morning they threw her out, they handed her a single bag. 8 months pregnant, no warning, no mercy. His mother didn't even look up from the table when she said it. Find other arrangements, permanently. And her husband? He stood in the doorway, asinating, and stared at the rug. They thought they were erasing her. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that her quiet, unassuming father had spent 30 years building something in the dark, not for himself, for this exact moment. The morning they pushed her out the door with one bag, they didn't know they had just handed her the key to a $14 billion fortress. They thought she was nothing. She was already inside their walls. Sometimes, the people who strip everything away are the ones who reveal exactly how powerful you truly are. A father's silent love, 30 years in the making, is a weapon no one ever sees coming. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they had all the power, stay with us. Don't go anywhere. Hit that like button right now so this story reaches someone who needs it today. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the ending of this one, you will not see it coming.
I wonder, how many of us have seen the mask slip from someone we thought we knew? It's a moment that changes you forever. My silence felt like a betrayal, and I knew I couldn't let it stand. That morning, the sound I remember most was that silver letter opener. It was as sharp and cold as Mrs. Prescott herself. I was dusting in the hall when I saw her at the dining table, her posture rigid, looking like a queen, getting rid of something she no longer found useful. I heard her say my name. "Rosita," she called, her voice leaving no room for questions. "Pack a bag for Mrs. Clare. One bag. The guest house is no longer an option for her." Her words were as neat and tidy as the crease in her blouse. It was the beginning of the end, and I was being made a part of it. Find other arrangements, permanently. That's what she told Claire when she finally appeared in the doorway. Poor Claire, so pregnant, her back must have been killing her, wearing one of Mr. Donovan's old sweatshirts. She looked so confused, asking Mrs. Prescott to repeat herself. The look Margaret gave her wasn't angry. It was just final, like closing a business deal. I heard her talk about family standards and attorneys. I wanted to scream. Standards? What standards involved throwing out a pregnant woman who had shared their home for 3 years? It was all about money and control. Claire's hand went right to her belly, a mother's instinct. "I'm 8 months pregnant," she said, her voice so soft. It was like she was hoping to remind them of their own humanity. But Margaret just said, "Yes, dear," as if that was the very reason for it all. "It will be cleaner," she said. Cleaner. I saw the word hit Claire like a physical blow. She looked around the room, at Mr. Prescott pretending to read, at the fancy rug, and finally at her husband, Mr. Donovan, just standing there, in the doorway, a ghost in his own home. He was a coward. I saw it then, clear as day. He wouldn't step into the room, wouldn't even look at her. He just stared at that ridiculous rug as if it held all the answers. I saw Claire's hand fidget with her phone, her thumb swiping back and forth. She said his name, Donovan, and for a second, I thought he might break. That he might finally be a man. But he just cleared his throat and mumbled something about his mother's valid concerns. Then Claire said it, so simply it cut through all the lies. "I am carrying your child." And the whole room just went silent. The air was thick with what wasn't being said. The only sound was the ticking of that old clock. Tick, tock. Each one a second of his failure. Then Margaret mentioned my name. "I had Rosita pack some of your things," she said, moving on like the conversation was over. My heart sank. One bag. That's all they gave her. Claire stood there, just for a moment, and I could see the hope draining from her face. She was waiting for someone, anyone, to say this was wrong, but no one did, and my shame grew heavier. She walked to the door and saw the bag I'd packed, sitting there on the cold marble floor like an accusation. The bag was heavy, I'd made sure of it. While they were busy being cruel, I slipped things inside, not just clothes. Her mother's picture from her nightstand, the little book of poems she read to her belly every night, things they would have thrown away. I hoped its weight felt like a betrayal, a sign of how calculated this all was. I watched from the window as she lifted it, a strange driver, a black car. They'd thought of everything to make her feel alone. She got in, and the car sat there for a long time, its dark windows staring back at the house that had just spit her out. Of course, no one came out. They just let her go. From the upstairs window, I saw her on her phone. I prayed she was calling someone who would fight for her. Later, I'd find a scrap of paper with a name, Renee, and a number. I heard Claire's voice crack, even from a distance, inside that car, saying, "They kicked me out." There was a pause. I imagined her friend on the other end, the shock turning into cold fury, the kind of fury I was feeling, trapped behind these walls. The question wasn't if she was okay, it was if she was safe from people like this. I knew she wasn't. As the car pulled away and the iron gates closed, I saw her hand go to her stomach. Even from far away, I knew the baby was reminding her she wasn't alone. She wasn't crying, not yet. It was something else I saw on her face through the window before it turned, shock. The kind that comes when your whole life shatters in an instant. I thought about how happy she was when she found out she was pregnant, how she ran downstairs to tell him, her face glowing. They had destroyed that glow this morning, and I had stood by and watched it happen. The guilt was a stone in my gut. I remembered him kneeling beside her that day, saying it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. A perfect lie. As the car vanished down the drive, I cleaned the dining room, my hands shaking with anger. My silence felt like a crime. I found her address book, left on the hall table, open to the page with her friend Renee's address. It felt like a sign. That night, I took the small digital recorder I'd hidden in the library 2 days ago. The one that caught Margaret and her lawyer planning this whole thing. I put it in an envelope, addressed it to Renee, and walked to the mailbox at the end of the long drive. It was a small act, but it was a start, a flicker of hope against the crushing weight of my regret. I still see that first moment, her face through the car window. Her eyes were shut, her head tilted back like she was just trying to breathe. "Okay," she'd said. "I'm coming." The city blurred past her, but she wasn't seeing it. I watched the world she was leaving behind. People with their coffee, a mom with a stroller, a dog sitting perfectly at a crosswalk. All so normal, and for her, a million miles away. My apartment, with its vanilla candles and the same dryer sheet smell from college, was a world away too. It's a cluttered, lived-in space, not a show home. I got her on the couch and pushed the ottoman under her feet before she could even protest. I went to the kitchen, needing to do something with my hands. Anything. I filled the kettle, clinked mugs onto the counter, buying myself time before I asked the question that was eating me alive. I know her tells. We've been friends forever. Those busy kitchen sounds were my armor. How long has his mother hated you? My voice came out steadier than I felt. "She does not hate me," she answered, but then she paused. I could almost see her replaying that dining room scene, Margaret's hands, that letter opener. "She just never saw me. Always the girl from the wrong zip code. Connecticut, but the wrong part." I brought the mugs in, set one down, and looked her right in the eye, the way she's always said she appreciates. I had to know. "What did Donovan say?" She wrapped her hands around the mug, soaking in the warmth. "Nothing," she finally said. "He texted an hour after I left." She pulled out her phone, her voice flat as she read it aloud. "Claire, I am so sorry about how that went. Can we talk when things settle down? I stared at her phone, then at her, my own anger simmering. When things settle down? I repeated. When things settle down, she echoed, her voice hollow. You're 8 months pregnant, I reminded her, sleeping on my pull-out bed. I felt a pang of guilt. My awful pull-out bed, the one with the bar I've been meaning to fix for over a year. I put my mug down. And he wants to talk when things settle down? He said when things settle down, she corrected, then trailed off. I don't know the difference. The difference is, he's making it sound like a random event, like some storm that just blew in and messed things up, something he had no part in. She didn't respond, just stared into her mug. That night, I couldn't sleep either. I knew she was in my office, on that terrible bed with the bar digging into her back. I could almost feel her shifting, trying to get comfortable, while little Eleanor rolled inside her. All I could hear was the city hum and my own refrigerator buzzing through the wall, and all I could see were the ghosts of warnings I never gave. I remembered that first time she brought him to a party, how he appeared at her side, so smooth and perfect. He'd said something smart about a painting, and I watched her fall for it, thinking she'd found someone who truly saw things. Saw her. I saw it all, again. Rushing back, over 3 years, the Christmas Eve, his mother criticized her cooking, and he just laughed. A tiny laugh she told me was nothing. The gala, where Margaret introduced her as his wife, stretching the word out like it tasted bad. 6 months ago, when Margaret implied someone with her background would struggle with being a mother, every single time I saw Claire tell herself it was nothing, and I let her. I stood by and watched her believe it for 3 long years. God, I thought, I was such a coward. The signs were flashing, neon red, and I just stood there. I never pushed. I never said, "Are you sure?" Because it would have forced her to see it, and I knew how much she'd invested in this perfect picture she had painted. She was so sure he was a good man. Her entire life was built on that one single idea. At 6 in the morning, I heard her phone call. His voice, thick with sleep, filtered through the door. He'd slept. Of course he had. Then I heard her voice, low and steady. I need you to tell me what happened. Not what your mother decided. What you decided. The silence that followed was heavy, full of the words he was carefully choosing. The family has concerns about the direction of our marriage. His voice was so polished, so rehearsed, it made my skin crawl. I heard her make him repeat it. Donovan, that is a press release, she said, her voice like steel. Talk to me like a person. Another, longer silence. Then his voice changed. Quieter, maybe even ashamed. My father had a business arrangement with your family years ago. Something went wrong. My parents feel the marriage was ill-advised, given the history. A business arrangement. I heard Claire's voice tighten through the wall. What business arrangement? Silence again. I do not have all the details. What business arrangement, Donovan? Nothing. Then, Claire, I think you should speak to your mother. There are things about your father's estate that I was not told until recently. Things my family, your family. He just stopped. That gaping silence that stretched between them felt like it was right there in my apartment. In that quiet, I knew she heard it all. He knew. He'd known something all along. And now that his family was done with her, she was disposable. I felt the shift in the air, a change in the energy coming from the other room. Her sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury. I'm going to speak to my mother, she said, her voice perfectly calm. And then I am going to find out exactly what your family knows about my father. And then we are going to have a very different conversation. She hung up. Then she immediately dialed again. I heard the phone pick up on the other end almost instantly. Claire? Her mother's voice sounded strained, like she'd been waiting for this call for years. Mom? Claire said. What do you know about Dad's estate that I don't? The pause was long and heavy. I need you to come here, her mom finally said. There are things I should have told you a long time ago. Things your father asked me to wait on. I heard a faint shuffle from the other room, and I knew Claire was realizing it too. She wasn't crazy. They had been hiding something from her. I am on my way, Claire said. I heard the pull-out bed squeak as she got up, the sound of her finding her shoes, her coat. Then a soft knock on my bedroom door. I have to go to my mother's. I will. Explain everything later, she said, through the door. I was already awake, already listening. Do you need me to drive you? I asked, my voice ready. No, she said. I need to do this part alone. I watched from my window as she walked out into the gray morning light. The city was just waking up. She got in her car, pointed it toward Connecticut, and drove off to face whatever her father had left behind. The house would be the same. White paint, black shutters, the old oak tree, the bird feeder her dad, Owen, used to fill every Sunday. I imagined her sitting in the driveway, seeing it all, remembering the man she thought she knew. The man with his newspaper and plain coffee mug, the quiet, unassuming father. She never once suspected he was anything but what he seemed. I watched her car disappear, and a wave of helplessness washed over me. It wasn't enough to just offer a couch. It had never been enough. As her mother was getting the coffee ready and setting out the butter cookies, for a conversation she'd been dreading for years, I made a decision. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and started typing. I searched for the top divorce and estate attorneys in Fairfield County. I was done being a silent witness. I was going to help her find the truth. I remember the first time I saw his car, a polished beast that didn't belong on our quiet street. That was the day the lie began. I knew Owen, Claire's father, for 30 years. He was a good man, a quiet man who kept to himself. What I saw in that young man's eyes was the opposite of everything Owen stood for. I told myself it was none of my business. A bitter regret I've swallowed for years. I saw him charm Diane, saw Claire fall for him, and I stayed quiet behind my curtains. I knew Owen had been hurt badly once, by partners who took everything. I saw history repeating, and I chose to water my hydrangeas instead of speaking up. I saw her car pull up this morning, 8 months pregnant and carrying the weight of the world. Through my kitchen window, I watched them talk. I couldn't hear the words, of course, but I saw the moment the ground fell out from under Claire. The shock, the disbelief, the way she held onto the table as if the world was tilting. It was a silence so heavy I could feel it across the yard. $14 billion. I wouldn't learn the number until later, but I saw its impact in the way she stumbled outside, gasping for air, a ghost on her own mother's porch. And all I could think was, I did nothing. She looked just like him then, standing out there. Owen Whitmore, a man who wore a simple watch and drove an American car, who filled that very bird feeder every Sunday morning. He called Claire his greatest achievement, and I always thought he meant the lovely person she was. I was wrong. He meant the fortress he'd built around her without her even knowing. I watched her stand there, one hand on her belly, and I knew she was finally seeing her father for who he was. Not just a dad, but a guardian, a silent protector who had seen this day coming from 1,000 miles away. He had prepared for this, and I had just watched. Someone was always coming for what wasn't theirs. Owen knew that better than anyone. He hadn't just made money. He'd built her an escape route, a secret passage out of a life she hadn't realized was a cage. He'd spent 3 decades laying the bricks, and he'd done it so quietly I never suspected a thing. He wanted her to be free, not burdened by the weight of his fears. I saw her touch her stomach, whispering to the child inside, and a wave of shame washed over me. He had been a truly interesting man, and I had been a coward of a neighbor. She went back inside, her back straight, and picked up her coffee. She was his daughter, all right. They talked for hours. As the afternoon sun slanted across my lawn, I remembered all the little things I'd dismissed. A neighborhood barbecue, Donovan's mother asking questions about Owen's work that felt too sharp, too focused. I remembered Garrett Prescott, the father, asking Claire once if she was close to her father's old colleagues. It was all reconnaissance. They were mapping her, looking for the treasure they suspected was buried. Every memory was a fresh stab of guilt. I had the puzzle pieces scattered in my mind for years and never once tried to put them together. I even helped them once without knowing. Margaret Prescott asked about Owen, and I said he was a simple consultant. I remember the look that passed over her face. It wasn't relief. It was confirmation. They were looking for a quiet fortune, and I'd just told them they'd found the right place, just as people. Donovan had said once, when Claire walked in on a call, not a lie, just not the truth. They weren't his people, they were hunters. And I had watched them set the trap, watched Claire walk right into it, and I had held my tongue. The next morning, I saw her leave the house. There was a new stillness about her, a frightening calm. It wasn't the absence of pain, it was the presence of purpose. Owen had that same look after his wife passed. It was the look of someone who knew a storm was coming, but had already decided to walk straight through it. As her car disappeared down the street, I went to the old roll-top desk in my study. Owen had given me an envelope 4 years ago, right after he got his diagnosis. For Diane, he'd said. Only if it looks like Claire's in a fight she doesn't know she's in. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. I imagined her meeting the lawyer, a woman named Sylvia Holloway. Owen had mentioned her name once, a long time ago. He trusted her. I pictured a quiet office, smelling of old books and integrity, a place where secrets were kept safe. I could see Claire sitting there, her father's eyes in her face, finally learning the truth. And I pictured the lawyer looking at her with a profound sense of relief, the relief of a watchman whose long duty was finally nearing its end. The relief of knowing the help you've guarded for so long has finally reached the person who needs it most. People misunderstood Owen. They saw a quiet man who enjoyed his garden. They didn't see the strategist, the survivor who had been financially shattered in his 20s and spent the next 15 years painstakingly rebuilding not just his wealth, but his defenses. He wasn't just investing in tech and property. He was investing in his daughter's future freedom. He was playing a long, patient game against ghosts he knew would one day come for her. He knew you had to be willing to wait a decade for the right move to pay off. And he had waited his whole life for this one. The Prescotts. They weren't a family. They were a hostile takeover firm, and they had targeted my Claire, the girl I'd watched grow up, as their next acquisition. The thought was so cold, so clinical, it made my stomach turn. Owen was right. He had been so right about the kind of danger that existed in the world. He knew people like that were out there, and he'd prepared for them. The proof wasn't just in a bank account. It was in the steel I'd seen in his daughter's spine that morning. She was the fortress he had built. Owen was a chess player. He hadn't just thought about Donovan. He had anticipated him, studied the archetype of him, and built a legal wall so perfect, so airtight, that men like him would find no handhold. He'd been fooled once, and he spent his life ensuring his daughter never would be. As I stood by my window, holding the heavy envelope, I finally understood. Owen hadn't just left her money. He'd left her weapons. I took a deep breath, opened my front door, and walked across the grass that separated our homes. It was time to deliver Owen's final move. I remember the first time I saw her shrink. It was subtle, the way she'd quiet her voice when he entered a room. Now, watching her on my kitchen floor, surrounded by a sea of paper, it felt like I was seeing her for the first time. She whispered it, then said it again, her voice shaking. He had shares in Prescott Holdings. 19%, a voice on the phone confirmed. Bought over 11 years, hidden in shell companies, all starting after they first destroyed him. A scheme orchestrated by Garrett Prescott himself. Claire just stared at the papers. Her father, ruined by them at 29, had spent 15 years getting back on his feet. Then, for 11 more, he'd secretly bought his way into their fortress. A quiet 30-year war. He never breathed a word, because the only move that mattered was the last one. 19%, Claire repeated. Enough for a seat at their table. When the board restructured, the voice on the phone, Sylvia, had already been busy. She'd found 2 other minority shareholders, both unhappy with the way the Prescotts were running things. With Claire's 19%, they'd have 41%. I heard the numbers, and my mind reeled. 41%. Enough to call their leadership into question, to force their hand, to make that family realize they'd made a catastrophic error. They hadn't just tried to take from Claire, they had given her the very weapon she needed to dismantle their empire. That night, she couldn't be still. Every document Sylvia gave her was laid out on my floor, a mosaic of a life I never knew existed. She sorted them by year, by type, by name. I just sat on my couch, eating a bowl of cereal, feeling useless, watching something impossibly large unfold in my tiny apartment. I pointed at a logo. "Your dad owned a piece of that app I use every day?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "And that news network, and 3 hotels out in Colorado, and some shipping company in Ohio." I put my bowl down, stunned. "Claire?" I started, knowing no words were enough. "I know," she said. It was 2:17 in the morning. Her back had to be killing her. She was 8 months pregnant, on my hard floor, piecing together the secret legacy of a man I only knew as the guy who drove a simple car, wore a cheap watch, and filled a bird feeder on Sundays. Then she started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a release, deep and startling, the kind of laughter that's been trapped for too long. I stared, worried. "Is this a breakdown?" I asked. "I don't know," she said, her voice catching. "Maybe it's the opposite." She looked at the empire laid out before her. $14 billion, 19% of Prescott Holdings, and a trust so brilliantly shielded, it was basically a fortress. Her birthday was just 6 weeks off. "I just have to make it," she whispered to herself. "I just have to make it there." But they moved quicker than we thought. 3 days later, a courier delivered a packet from Donovan's lawyer, a petition to have their marriage annulled. The reason? Fraud. They claimed she had hidden her financial status from him before they got married. The nerve was almost impressive. I read the document twice, feeling a hot, useless anger build in my chest. I set it on the table like it was something toxic. "They're accusing you of fraud," I said, my voice flat with disbelief. "Yes," she replied. "Me, the woman who had no idea she was worth $14 billion, is being accused of hiding it by the very people who sent their son to marry her for that exact reason." "It's a bold move," Claire said. "I'll give them that." She was trying for sarcastic, but I could feel the tremor beneath it. Being sarcastic was the only way she could talk about it without crumbling, because under that thin layer of humor was something I knew she was feeling, something she hadn't said to me yet. She was terrified. She had 37 days until she turned 29. She was 8 months pregnant. She was sleeping on my pull-out sofa with a metal bar digging into her back. She had a lawyer she'd known for a week, and a husband whose response to her pregnancy and homelessness was a legal attack. She disappeared into the bathroom. I heard the water run for a bath, and she stayed in there for almost 40 minutes. When she came out, she hadn't washed her hair or anything. She just sat in the hot water, her belly a small island, and she breathed. I watched her later, sitting on the cold tile floor wrapped in a towel, and knew she was thinking about her dad. How they broke him at 29. How he spent 3 decades building something they could never touch. I'm 37 days from 29, I heard her whisper. I just have to get there. The baby kicked, a slow roll I could see from across the room. I know, she murmured, her hand on her stomach. We'll be okay. She said it with a conviction I knew she didn't feel, but saying it was a start. Then she called Sylvia. They filed for the annulment, she said. Claiming fraud. I expected this. Sylvia's voice crackled through the phone. Impossibly calm. It was the calm we were both leaning on. That woman was never rattled by the things meant to rattle you. An annulment simplifies the trust transfer, she explained. It also kills any claim they have to marital property, but they're saying I committed fraud. It won't stick, Sylvia assured her. The charge needs you to have known, and we have proof you didn't. Sylvia paused. Let them file. It helps us. Those words, let them file, I saw them land on Claire. It was the moment a defense turned into an attack. What do I do? Claire asked. Keep doing exactly what you're doing, Sylvia said. I have a meeting with Clark Merritt next week. There's another part of your father's plan you need to see. Something about the Prescott shares. What about them? Your father didn't just buy them to have them, Sylvia said. He bought them as a key. When you see everything, you'll understand his endgame. What was his endgame? Sylvia paused. He made sure that if anyone ever came looking for a fight, you were already inside their gates. Donovan called later that night. Not his lawyer, but him. I saw his name on her screen, and she let it ring 4 times before answering. Claire? His voice was tired, genuinely exhausted, in a way I hadn't heard since they were first married. Back when he sometimes spoke to her like a person. I need to talk to you. Then talk, she said, her voice like ice. I just want you to know this isn't how I wanted this to go. How did you want it to go? A long silence stretched out, and I could practically hear him scrambling. I don't know, he finally admitted. I thought, maybe you'd find out about your father, about everything, and we could just talk about it. And then what? Claire pressed. We'd talk, and then what? He had no answer. Donovan, she said. Her voice wasn't angry anymore. It was hollowed out, final. You married me for that trust. He didn't even try to deny it. I had been dreading that moment for her, expecting it to break her. Instead, I watched as something in her settled. It wasn't a shatter. It was a click. The sound of a lock finding its place. Did you ever love me? She asked. She wasn't asking for him. She was asking for herself. She needed to know if any of it had been real. There was a very long pause. I think I did, he said at last. I think that's what made it so hard. He loved her, but not enough. It told her everything. She wasn't nothing to him, but she wasn't enough, and she deserved to be more than that. I am going to protect our daughter, Claire said, her voice steady. Whatever happens, she will be safe. I hope you'll be in her life, but I won't wait for you to figure it out. She ended the call. She walked to my kitchen counter and just stared out at the city lights. I watched her reflection in the glass and thought, somewhere along the line, she had vanished into his life. She had made herself smaller and smaller to fit and told herself it was okay until she couldn't even see herself anymore. I saw her stand up straighter. That person was gone for good. She called Sylvia back. I'm ready, she said. For whatever is next, I'm ready. Clark Merritt came to Sylvia's office on a Tuesday. Claire told me he carried an old briefcase and had the aura of a man whose patience was finally being rewarded. He was 60 years old, meticulous, and spoke about billions of dollars, like they were items on a shopping list. He laid out 3 documents on the table. "Your father," he said, looking right at her, "was a brilliant architect." He pointed to the first paper. "This is the portfolio, $14.3 billion as of last month's valuation." As she was leaving my apartment that morning, I stopped her. I pressed a small framed photo into her hand, one of her and her dad I'd saved from her boxes. It was all I could do. A small, silent reminder of who she was fighting for. It began the day I laid out his life's secret work for his daughter. Diversified assets, real estate, and infrastructure built to last for generations. I moved to the second file. The trust, as I explained, holds 19% of Prescott Holdings. Acquired over 11 years, each share cloaked in a different company, none pointing back to Owen Whitmore. I then presented the third document. The part she didn't know, I told her, was that her father had contacted 2 other minority shareholders years ago, a banker with 12% and a family trust with 10. Both were already at odds with the Prescott board. I watched her eyes as she did the math. 19 plus 12 plus 10, 41%. He created the alliance, she realized, her voice filled with awe. He'd prepared the ground before he passed, leaving her to give the signal. I confirmed it wasn't left to fate. I watched him correspond with them for 3 years, building trust, telling them just enough, assuring them his proxy would one day make contact. He planned for all of it, she whispered. He planned for every possibility he could foresee, I thought. After she left, I saw her from my window, sitting in her car for 25 minutes, just absorbing the truth about the father she thought she knew, and the man who had wronged her. She must have pictured him then, on his porch with his newspaper and tea, wearing that simple watch, all while directing a 30-year campaign from a quiet corner of Connecticut, patient and utterly convinced. I remembered him at her graduation, the rare full hug he gave her, telling her she could do anything she decided to do. A promise, not a platitude. He had spent 3 decades building the proof, constructing the very world where that statement would be legally and financially true for her. I learned later that she called her mother, asking if she knew about the Prescott shares. No. Her mother, Diane, had only found out from me that morning. I could picture them sharing that laugh that's half tears, the kind reserved for those who share an immense loss. He was something else, Claire had said. He really was, Diane had agreed, her voice soft. Everything he did, every single part of it, was for you. Claire waited in that lot until the overwhelming weight of it all settled into something she could manage. That evening, she called Preston Vale, the Prescott's lawyer, using the number from her annulment papers. He answered with the caution of a man expecting a difficult call. "Miss Whitmore," he began, "I'm not sure we should be—" "I control a trust holding 19% of Prescott Holdings," she stated. "I'm aligned with 2 other shareholders. Together, we hold 41%. You might want to discuss this with your clients before next month's board meeting." The silence on her end must have been absolute. "Furthermore," she added, "we have records of certain early business activities of Garrett Prescott that regulators might find compelling. I am prepared to share them if a reasonable arrangement isn't met." A reasonable arrangement. The same words Margaret Prescott used to dismiss her. "I'll speak with the family," Preston managed. "You have 48 hours," she replied, and hung up. In the quiet of her friend's kitchen, she finally felt like herself again, whole and unapologetic. Starting over no longer seemed daunting. It felt right. Staying had always been the harder choice, a truth she'd ignored until then. 3 weeks before her birthday, Ainsley Prescott called her. Claire almost didn't pick up, but then she remembered Ainsley was never the cruel one. "I heard what my mother did," Ainsley said, straight to the point. "I want you to know it was wrong. Why are you calling me?" Claire asked her. There was a pause. Because I've watched my mother behave this way my whole life and said nothing. You're pregnant, and she threw you out. The words seemed difficult for her. I am ashamed of us. I was surprised to hear it cost her something to admit. Thank you, Claire said. That means something. If you need anything for the baby, I'll let you know, Claire promised. She told her friend Renee about the call. Renee listened, then said she never truly understood that family, never believed in the facade. Why didn't you say anything? Claire asked. Because you seemed happy, Renee answered, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin it. Claire thought about that. I think I knew, she admitted. I saw it all. I just chose not to look. We all do that, Renee said. The hardest part, Claire confessed, was admitting she knew all along. And Renee just held her hand, offering silence when it was needed most. The days found a new rhythm for her. Coffee with Renee, calls with me, slow evening walks as Eleanor made her presence known. She studied the documents I gave her, learning the landscape of her father's legacy, not as a sum, but as a territory. She was learning her inheritance, just as Owen had learned his battlefield. She was preparing. The night her water broke, she was on the couch, eating crackers, looking at an old college photo of her and Renee on a bookshelf, a time before she knew what there was to worry about. They looked so young, so free of concern. I wasn't worried then because I didn't know what was coming, she must have thought. Now I know, and I'm still standing. Then, at 3:47 in the morning, she felt it. She looked down, then at the TV, then at the crackers. Renee, she said, then louder. Her friend bolted upright. What is it? I think it's time, Claire answered. The next 20 minutes were a blur of organized chaos. A moment prepared for that still felt like a complete surprise. Renee grabbed the hospital bag and called a car. Claire found her shoes and called her mother. So then, after a small hesitation, she called me because I had asked her to. I answered on the second ring. It's time, she said. I'll meet you there, I replied and hung up. She didn't call Donovan. A conscious choice, no guilt attached. It would be his first test. During labor, everything else faded away. The trust, the Prescotts, the 41%, her father's 30-year plan. All that remained was her and her breathing, and the work of bringing her daughter into the world. Eleanor arrived at 7:42 in the morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with dark hair and Owen Whitmore's nose. I saw it instantly, that familiar slight upturn at the tip, her father's nose, on a new face. In the sterile hospital light, she held her daughter and spoke the name she'd chosen weeks ago after she'd learned the truth about the man who built her a fortress. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor Owen Whitmore. Not Prescott. Whitmore. Renee cried quietly by the window. Diane held a forgotten cup of cold coffee. I stood by the door, my hands folded, finally seeing the end of a story I had guarded for so long. Donovan called 6 hours later, model. I remember the first time I felt truly useless, watching her in that hospital bed. Eleanor was just a tiny, perfect bundle in a plastic cot, and Claire was just trying to breathe. I saw his name flash on her phone screen, and a coldness spread through me. She just let it go to voicemail. I knew then that whatever came next would be handled by lawyers, not by a shattered new mother. She was talking to her baby, whispering about the grandfather Eleanor would never meet. How he would have adored her, taught her about the birds, and shared quiet evenings on the porch. A terrifying calm settled over her as she looked at me. I think I finally know what to do, she'd said, and I didn't doubt her for a second. 11 days later, on her 29th birthday, the world shifted. It was a gray, quiet Tuesday. I was making coffee, trying to create some sense of normalcy, while Diane, a rock for days, read by the window. Eleanor was finally asleep, making those precious baby noises that say all is right with the world, for now. Then Claire's phone buzzed. At 9:14, a message from her lawyer confirmed the trust was hers, ending with words that made my throat ache. Your father would be very proud. Not 20 minutes later, another text came through from the bank, a number so staggering it felt like a typo. $14.3 billion, all of it hers. She was on my couch, in clothes she'd worn for days, still learning the rhythms of feeding a newborn, her focus entirely on Eleanor. She passed me the phone without a word. I read the texts, my mind struggling to grasp the scale of it all. I looked from the phone to her, then to the baby, then back to my friend, whose life had just been irrevocably altered. I finally found my voice and asked, "What are you going to do?" I saw the answer in her eyes before she even picked up the phone to call Preston Vale. She was going to use it exactly as her father intended, to build a free life. I heard the speed of his reply, the readiness in his voice. "Miss Whitmore," he began, and I knew the fight had started. I held Eleanor while she spoke, my heart pounding for her. She laid out the terms she'd been building in her mind for weeks, each one a brick in the wall she was constructing around her daughter. There was no anger in her voice, only a steely resolve. She wasn't looking for revenge or destruction. She was securing a future, ensuring clean endings, and making it so the name Prescott would one day be nothing but a distant echo. She demanded full legal custody, with visitation only if Donovan truly wanted to be a father, and a trust for Eleanor, separate and untouchable. It was breathtaking to witness. She wanted a complete accounting of their assets and a legally binding silence from every single member of his family. Then she delivered the final blow. I listened as she calmly explained that in return, she would shelve the evidence her lawyer had on Garrett Prescott's shady business deals and wouldn't use her new power as a shareholder to wreck their company. I could almost feel the stunned silence on the other end of the line. "You have 48 hours, she said, her voice impossibly steady. She hung up, her gaze softening as she looked down at Eleanor, who was just blinking up at her, utterly unaware of the world being remade in her name. They caved in 36 hours, not the full 48. She told me later that their quick surrender meant the dirt she had on them was even worse than she'd imagined. I wasn't there when she signed the papers in Sylvia's office, with her lawyer on one side and the banker on the other, but I saw her right after. Eleanor had been in her carrier, just taking in the world. Sylvia told her that her father had prepared for so much, but he never could have imagined how brilliantly his own daughter would finish his work. When Claire told me that, I saw a flicker of the man I'd barely known in her eyes. "I think he started this," she told me. "I just finished it." When she picked up Eleanor's carrier to leave my house that day, she seemed taller. The weight she'd been carrying for months, the one I'd felt so helpless to lift, was gone. In its place was a new kind of gravity, a sense of being perfectly centered. She stepped out into a quiet, gray afternoon, the kind of day you'd never remember, except I always will. With $14 billion, a sealed agreement, and her daughter, she could go anywhere. She just stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing, finally and completely independent. 10 days after the signing, she decided to meet them. She didn't have to. It was all over. But she told me there was something she had to do herself, something beyond lawyers. That morning, I went to her with a small box. Her mother had sent over some of Owen's things. Inside was his watch, simple and plain. I'd almost set it aside, but something made me give it to her. "Here," I said, "maybe you should wear this." It felt like a small, foolish gesture, but as it slid onto her wrist, fitting perfectly, I saw her straighten her shoulders. It was my one small act, a way of making sure her father was with her in that room. I watched Eleanor while she was gone, my thoughts entirely with her. I pictured her walking into that sterile lobby with its marble floors and pretentious art, a place designed to make people feel small. I imagined her riding the elevator up to the 14th floor, a den of people who had tried to break her. She faced them alone, with her father's watch on her wrist. I hoped she could feel him there, feel all the years of his quiet work that had led to this moment. I hoped she knew she wasn't truly alone, that I was here, holding her future, praying for her. When she came back, she told me everything. How she sat directly across from Margaret, and how she saw the woman's composure crack just for a second. This wasn't the girl they thought they could discard. This was someone new. She said she looked at Donovan, and for the first time, he actually met her gaze. She hadn't expected to feel anything, but what she felt was a profound pity. Not for herself, but for him. For the man he'd allowed his family to shape him into. A man who would forever be trapped in a gilded cage. She told them Eleanor would know her father, if he chose to be a father. She promised she would never poison her daughter against his family. This isn't about revenge, she told them, my voice shaking a little as she recounted it. My father was once ruined by men like you. He could have lived for revenge, but instead he lived to build something. He built something so strong that, in the end, you became irrelevant. As she spoke, my own guilt for having stood by silently for so long finally lifted. My role was never to fight her battles, but to hold the space she needed to win her own. I remember the day I knew something was wrong. From my window, I saw her through the glass of their ballroom, a ghost at her own party. I watched Garrett Prescott look down at her, a flicker of something cold in his eyes. Like a man realizing he'd been outplayed in a game I never even knew was happening. Margaret's voice carried across the lawn, sharp and clear. Your father was a formidable man, she'd said. I saw Claire nod. He was. Margaret added, he outsmarted us, and her tone was flat, just a fact stated in the cool evening air. Yes, Claire agreed. He did. Then Margaret said something that sounded almost kind. You are very like him. It was the most genuine thing I'd heard from that house in 3 years. Thank you, I saw Claire mouth. I will take that. She stood, shook Garrett's hand like a business partner. She gave Margaret a final, brief nod. Her eyes found Donovan's for a moment, and though I couldn't hear her, her lips formed a plea. Then she turned, her bag in hand, and walked toward the door, away from them all. I watched her go, a straight-backed silhouette against the light. I held my breath as she disappeared from my view, and I let it out slowly, a knot of guilt tightening in my stomach. For months I wondered what became of her. I'd see that house, quiet and imposing, and think of her coolly touching her father's watch, her only armor. 6 weeks after her little girl, Eleanor, was born, a moving truck pulled up to the empty house down my new, much quieter street. She could have bought a palace. With $14 billion, she could have bought the whole town. But she chose that white colonial, the one with the fence that needed mending, and the west-facing porch that catches the last of the sun. It was that very porch, I think, that drew her here. A place to breathe after leaving that gilded cage behind. I watched her move in on a Thursday. Her mother came that evening, and I saw their easy rhythm through the kitchen window as they put things away, their comfortable silence as eloquent as their quiet chatter, while the baby slept peacefully in her carrier. A friend of hers, a lively woman named Renee, showed up on Saturday. She came bearing gifts, a bottle of wine, a bag of coffee, and a sturdy-looking houseplant she placed on the counter. You cannot kill this one, I heard her say through the open window, her voice full of laughter. I looked it up. Claire's reply was faint. I killed the last one. I know, the friend said. That is why I looked it up. They sat on that back porch, and their conversation drifted over the fence about nothing and everything the way true friends do. Then, on Sunday, Ainsley Prescott's car pulled up. She hesitated on the sidewalk, holding a small gift, looking like she expected to be turned away. But Claire opened the door and just said, "Come in." I saw the tension leave Ainsley's shoulders, the unmistakable relief of someone bracing for rejection and finding acceptance instead. I watched them sit among the boxes, and I thought that maybe this was how real connections were built, slowly, with patience. I had plenty of patience, I realized, but I hadn't had the courage. A fancy cream-colored envelope arrived from Donovan that week. I saw her read it once, then put it away in a box. I imagined it was for Eleanor's story, the true one, not the polished version the Prescotts would tell. The real story is what that little girl deserved. I often watched Claire in the yard during those quiet hours and imagined the truths she was storing up for her daughter. She would tell her about her grandfather, who built an empire not from anger, but from a fierce, quiet love, the kind of love that fills a bird feeder on a Sunday. She'd warn her to watch people's actions more than their words, because the truth always lives in the space put between the two. The hardest part wasn't walking away with nothing but a bag. It was admitting you saw the bars on the cage all along. It was admitting that I, too, had seen the truth from my window and had chosen not to look. Looking at hard things takes practice, I thought, and I should have started practicing a long time ago. She would tell her daughter that their name was a gift, earned through years of quiet work. One Thursday in late October, with the air growing crisp, I saw Claire carry Eleanor out to the porch. The light was that perfect golden autumn shade that makes you feel like you're in a painting. She sat in a new wooden chair, solid and meant to last, and placed an old plain watch on the table beside her. The baby was mesmerized by the light, her face full of wonder. I watched Claire look at her garden, at the broken fence, at the sky turning from gold to amber. I thought about the man who must have owned that watch, a man who built so much, not for power, but to give his daughter a door she could walk through anytime. A door to absolute freedom. I saw then that he hadn't done it for himself. He did it so she would never be trapped, so no one could ever lock a door on her and keep the key. He did it so she could find her way here, to this exact quiet moment. I remember the first time I saw her, a ghost on her own porch. It was like she'd walked through a war to get there, carrying a victory no one else could see. She wasn't in some fancy dining room anymore, or in a car speeding away from a life that had crumbled. She was right there, across the lawn, staring into space as if she were piecing together a puzzle she'd ignored for years. I'd watch from my window, a prisoner in my own home, too cowardly to cross the grass. I saw her trying to make herself smaller, to mend a cage I didn't understand, and the guilt of my silence started to build right then. I never tried the door to her world. I just watched her realize her own had been open this whole time. I saw her start to live again, walking toward that freedom instead of fixing the walls. I'd see her out there with her little girl, Eleanor, both of them just watching the evening light change. The sun would set, the garden would get quiet, and I'd think about how I was missing it all. She was discovering that the quiet moments weren't just the gaps between the big events. They were the big events, and I was just a shadow, watching from the sidelines, regretting every day I hadn't just said hello. The bird feeder, the porch in the evening, the plain watch. I saw her pick it up, turning it over in her hands before setting it back down. He would have loved you so much, she told Eleanor, and the ache I'd been feeling in my own chest for her seemed to dissolve, replaced by the warmth of that evening light. "We are going to be okay," she said, not with false hope, but with a simple certainty. And I knew it was true. The next morning, I cut a few of my late husband's prize-winning roses. I walked across the lawn, my heart beating a little faster. It was a small act, a fence that needed mending, a neighbor saying hello. It was a start. And tonight, it was undeniable. We were both going to be okay. As the sky shifted from blue to that soft, early evening dark and the first stars came out, Eleanor drifted off to sleep on her mother's chest. The sight was so solid, so real. Claire stayed right there, a queen on her porch. She had her $14 billion, her settlement, and her daughter. She had a friend who brought coffee on Saturdays, and a mother who called every morning. She had this whole fortress of support, and I realized my silence was the only thing keeping me locked away. She was exactly where she needed to be. She chose it. She'd walked right through a door that had been built for her and was standing on the other side, needing no one's permission to be there. As the night grew deeper, I stayed at my window, watching Owen Whitmore's daughter with her own child sleeping over her heart. And then I moved. I walked out my own door, across the lawn, and held out the small bouquet I'd picked from my garden. It wasn't much, but it was my step toward a fair outcome. It was my way of finally saying I saw her. Her story wasn't over, and maybe, just maybe, mine wasn't either. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.